I'm so glad I got to go second, because this gave me such an incredible sense of what you guys are doing here and what you could do with the education here. It was very impressive. Well, since I wasn't introduced, I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I'm an architectural historian. I work on the ways in which race is constructed through architecture. I wrote a book called Street Value with Rostin Wu back in 2010. That's about race and space and the planning of downtowns in New York City. And let's see, I've also been working for a really long time on the relationship between architecture and agriculture. So I'll speak a little bit about that tonight, and that's the reason for the title of my talk. I think I'm feeding back a little bit. I don't know if I should move. Anyway, it's a really big honor to be part of your 50th anniversary celebration, so thank you for having me, and I'm honored to be here. So many of us have long been saying that our profession is too small and not inclusive enough. I could cite dire statistics that you guys are probably familiar with, that only 1/5 of 1% of registered architects in Canada are from First Nations, or how few Latina and African American women in particular are registered architects in the United States. I don't even have the statistics for First Nations people in the US who are registered architects. Hopefully you guys are aware of these. Changing these statistics, but also changing our practices to make them more inclusive, requires a bunch of things. It requires changing how we recruit students, how we retain and mentor them, how we retain and mentor faculty, how we help our colleagues. It's a very slow process, but one that's really worthwhile. And so this is an experiment that I have done every year for the past couple of years when I give a lecture on who architects are. And I always Google architect on a browser with no cookies. Can you hear me or no?
That mic is muted.
Oh, okay. So I need to, oh yeah, I see. I have the same mics at Pratt, but you'd think I get it. Anyway, so as you can see, this is the snapshot from 2016. There's one woman and one person of color. And I do this in a browser with no cookies, so they can't know that I'm a secret feminist. Or not so secret, actually. And the second one from this year, I was actually really surprised. This is the first year that it's changed when I've Googled architect. So there are now 4 women, but no people of color. So we lost one person of color and gained a woman. And this is in spite of the fact that there are many flourishing women and minority-owned firms. Here's one of the oldest, McKissick and McKissick, and groups that are doing really important activism to change the composition of the profession, like the group NOMA. Whoa. So since I have no ability to reprogram Google search engines, the thing that I have decided as a historian that I can do is to intervene by making new canons. A canon is the set of shared narratives and operations that make a field legible to itself, that make it into a kind of community. It's something that's invented, right? A canon does not always exist as a given. It's something that we perpetuate every time we teach an architectural history class, every time we design a curricula, every time we gather as a school. Canons, like languages, are constantly in flux, and they're remade through use. I'm going to try that. Maybe that'll help. Making new canons is, of course, an enormous task, and it's one that's been underway in earnest in our field for many, many years. I mean, at least 40 years, right? So at first, the desire to reshape canons has had to do with inclusivity and geography. This is Bannister Fletcher's Tree of Architecture from his textbook, which was widely used when my father was an architecture student, and even, through the 70s. And as you can see in the image, there's a tree that takes Western architecture and brings it up to the present, but every other culture supposedly just stops at a certain point and doesn't develop any further. And of course, this is a totally untrue image and a highly problematic one. And the architectural historian Sibyl Bosdogan wrote a very important critique of Bannister Fletcher's method and a call for curricular change in the 90s. Called Architectural History and Professional Education, Reflections on Post-Colonial Challenges to the Modern Survey, which I usually have all my grad students read. So I've been curious, as an educator, why, given the strength and ferocity of these criticisms in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in particular, have they not taken hold across architecture schools around North America? But I have been excited recently that 2 movements in particular, the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement more recently, tend to pick up where the texts of the 70s left off. So there's this sort of explosion of feminist architecture critique in the 70s. Hopefully you guys all know these books, and then some more recent ones, and now, of course, websites, including the Feminist Wall of Shame, which calls out lecture series which include no women. We also have many books and histories and narratives that critique white privilege, and also ones that help us imagine the aesthetics of equity and the ways in which race is constructed through architecture. So work by people like Mabel Wilson and Craig Wilkins and Mario Gooden, and Gerald Fields and Dell Upton and Diane Harris have all made really huge contributions to the way that we, especially in the US with our legacy of slavery, need to think about the exclusion of African American architects from our profession historically, and also what Black aesthetics might be. So another thing that I do is I'm the editor of Aggregate, a website that publishes architectural history and theory in open access form. And one of the projects that we did right after the Black Lives Matter movement got very big was to call together a bunch of architects and historians and urbanists to think about how architectural history could contribute to the Black Lives Matter movement and how Black Lives Matter could contribute to how we think about architecture. So that's this here. And one of the biggest conclusions that we got from this was actually from a student, from Hector Torito Picart, who is at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, who argued very forcefully that we need to think about the aesthetics of Black people in particular, and of Black aesthetics, but also to kind of get away from narratives of critiquing oppression solely, but to find ways to really get more buildings by African American people into our canons. So I was very grateful to him for that very strong call. Oops, I think there was one more thing I wanted to say here. So yes, we have a lot of critical discourse that we need, like in all of this feminist work and in this critical race theory, and we could also talk about all kinds of other forms of exclusion in which there is a well-developed critical vocabulary. And yet we still don't always have all of the buildings and objects and narratives that we need to get into our cultural history classes, and we have a problem that architectural practice and architectural theory tend to move at different paces. There is now tons and tons of architectural theory and history that is ready to be canonized, and yet there aren't always studio professors who are ready to incorporate that work into their canons, right? And so, and sometimes there's really great stuff happening in studio that never makes its way into history either. So one of the things that I'm interested in is, like, how can we take these forms of criticism and get them into our teaching and in our schools? So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, where I teach. I was asked to teach a class called Non-Western Architecture. This was content that was required by the National Architectural Accreditation Board in the early 2000s. And I inherited this wonderful syllabus from Ezra Akcan, who is now at Cornell and who I think deserves great credit in our field for imagining how we could teach a critical history of global architecture. And one that also made a lot of sense to me because my background was in philosophy, and one of the things she did was to pair philosophers and works of architecture. So inheriting her syllabus, and we sort of shared this group of key protagonists and thinkers who the students would start off by reading: Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, and Gayatri Spivak. Has anyone here read anything by Gayatri Spivak before? One? What? Yes? Did you get it? Was it great? Because my students were like, I can't believe you're making me read this. It's so hard. And Spivak, so for those of you who have not read Spivak's work, she's a post-colonial theorist. She's one of the people that founded this field. And part of her argument is that translating someone's experience from one culture to another is nearly impossible, right? And we try to imagine that we can neatly translate experiences across cultures. We often negate the differences, the structural differences, the power differences, the economic differences, the linguistic differences that structure our relationship in the first place. So for me, for instance, as a white lady, to imagine that I could imagine or understand the experience of being a person of color would be a gross misreading and something that Spivak would have really critiqued. And this was work that she was doing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and she's still very active and quite a force today. If you can encounter her, go to one of her lectures. I highly advise it. Okay, but her text is incredibly difficult, in part because she's trying to teach us the experience of the difficulty of translating. And so untangling some of her philosophy requires really coming head to head with the legacy of post-structuralism and all kinds of things like that, which I won't go into. But together with these three theorists, Edward Said, who wrote about Orientalism, the practice of European historians, basically, of fetishizing other cultures as a reflection of power differences that already exist. And Frantz Fanon, who wrote a critique of the ways in which France, in particular, had oppressed Algerians in North Africa, and helped to come up with a set of critical terms that led to the end of French colonial rule in North Africa. All are really important. Of course, these are not architectural theorists. They're not writing about architecture. But after reading them, the students in our classes could start to do something really amazing. They could recognize that familiar texts, like Architecture Without Architects by Bernard Rudofsky, or Learning from Las Vegas by Eisenhower and Venturi and Scott Brown, were actually, in some ways, Orientalist texts. They took cultural and economic differences and acted as if they could be flattened, and as though architecture could just be translated. And so this makes us call into question whether it really is possible to study another culture in depth. Of course we can, but what can we do when we engage that culture? Do we end up appropriating it? Do we end up fetishizing it? What happens, right? So in our classes, our students were confronting, I'm not going to go through this because I'm taking too long, but our students really had to confront some of the ways in which they would be positioned as architects practicing in the field. Most of our graduates go on to work for large multinational firms where they're always building in cultures that they don't understand. And they have to think critically about how to do that, right? Is the answer international style modernism, the same thing built in every place? What happens when you try to engage a particular culture in the place that you're building? Can you do it as an outsider? Well, with the theory and ideas of Spivak, Fanon, and Said, our students realize that doing that is a process. It's one that's worth engaging in, but it's not one that can happen instantaneously and easily. And so cultural history, right, philosophy, helps to give us the tools to understand what would happen when producing architecture. Okay, I'm going to zip through some things. Okay. Don't skip. Okay. Well, we could also see it. I could really talk for a really long time, so I don't want to do that. We can also see this happening in modernism too, right? Bruno Taut going off and studying Japan and writing this kind of essential distillation of Japanese culture. Well, it turns out that this Japanese art philosopher Kuko Shuzo had done the same thing 6 years earlier, where he distills Japanese culture to its essences. So something that we might be really critical of, a Western architect, a German architect traveling to Japan and fetishizing its architecture is something that he, learned how to do from a philosopher who was doing it to his own culture. And that philosopher, in fact, had learned that while studying with Henri Bergson in France. Right? So there's all kinds of exchanges that are foundational, and they're international exchanges that are foundational to modern architecture. And contemporary architectural practice is highly globalized. So I really think that it's important that students learn these forms of exchange. Okay, so now, I should also say, in relation to what you were saying, Tammy, about having to teach yourself everything. So when I started grad school at Princeton in, I think it was 2003, I didn't learn anything about architecture from any single piece of architecture outside of Europe or the United States. And the only way that I could learn about internationally produced architecture was by walking across the street and going to the urban planning department and hanging out with all the planners who had actually left architecture school to be planners and were doing international work. So when I was asked to teach this class at Pratt after finishing my coursework, I had to teach myself as well. But what's astounding to me is that in just a few years, the entire field has changed, right? Princeton, where I went to school, now has Lucia Allais and Samia Heni, who are completely changing the curriculum there. So now we have different geographies, not just Europe and North America, but parts of the planet that have been subject to architecture just everywhere, right? We study different objects, so we're not just looking at buildings, but at landscapes and infrastructures and even flows of materials. And I know Jane Hutton teaches here, right? Yes, and so Jane's work is such a huge inspiration to me in that regard. And also, scholarship is produced in a really different way than it used to be, right? There's a lot of new forms of collaborative scholarship. So the Aggregate Architectural History Collaborative, which is me and 12 of my colleagues who decided we were tired of working alone in archives, have banded together to produce a lot of work and have tried to get new ways of workshopping history and theory with larger and larger groups. But there's also the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative, which is this incredible resource. Vikram Prakash and Mark Jarzenbach run it. It's funded by the Mellon Foundation, and it's basically a repository for syllabus materials. So for those of us that can't spend months learning about mosques in Cairo, maybe we could have Tammy's materials up there, or a bunch of us have placed some of our work up there too. So it becomes this incredible repository for sharing narratives, which none of us as scholars really are able to do in sufficient depth, right? I teach global surveys, and my students have 2 years of them, but I'm not a specialist in most of the architectures that I teach, and so it's an incredible resource to be able to share that, get that from other specialists. And there's also the Feminist Art and Architectural Collaborative, or FUC, and RAMP, the Race and Modern Architecture Project, which Mabel Wilson, Irene Chen and Charles Davis are running, which is producing some really fantastic work as well. So these shifts in our field have kind of armed us with a bunch of new precedents, right? I was talking to 2 students who were interviewing me prior to this about this sort of glut of precedents that historians wish that we could get into survey classes, and they've been sort of piling up recently. And so this means that we've been changing our classes. Like, we do talk about the legacies of neoclassicism, and we teach, Jeffersonian architecture. This is the campus of the University of Virginia. But we also now can teach neoclassicism through the work of the African-American architect Vertner Tandy, who designed this incredible Villa Lualo, which is hopefully not going to be torn down imminently, for Madam C.J. Walker, the first African-American millionaire. It's an incredible building with all these layers and depths, and that follows Beaux-Arts conventions but breaks from them in some really significant ways. So, it's fascinating to put together Jefferson and this and talk about the ways in which the Greek column becomes a symbol for respectability. This also impacts the ways in which we understand international architecture. Many of us that were educated in the time when I was, and Tammy was, encountered the architecture of Lagos through Rem Koolhaas's work, right? But recent scholarship on West African architecture has meant that in my architectural history classes, we now spend as much time looking at the architecture of West Africa as we do looking at the architecture of Italy, and that's including the Renaissance, right? So we can look at contemporary Lagos, but we look at the history of Igbo architecture. I have this amazing colleague, Adedoyin Tariba, who has done this fascinating research about mosques that were built in Lagos and other buildings that were built in Lagos by slaves that had once been from this part of the world, who learned Baroque building techniques in Brazil, right, from the Portuguese, and had to make Baroque churches, and took the building techniques that they used back to Lagos and created these new styles. So this is astounding that this is a mosque built in the style of Baroque architecture, right? And so Joyan's work has been really amazing, and I can't wait for it to be published, in helping us kind of talk about migrations and their impact on architectural culture. Other architectural historians, Ayala Levine and Yetunde Alaya, have done really important work on contemporary West African architecture, which they'd shared with us. And we have looked at Kunle Adeyemi's more recent projects, his floating school, which was shown at the Venice Biennale, and there was a temporary one that he had built in Nigeria as well, right? So this Nigeria is a place that has been touched by slavery and colonialism, that has this incredibly rich architectural past. It's a place where new styles are invented, and it's also a place with a very unique urban situation. And so it's fascinating for students to spend time learning from this space, which had been entirely excluded from my curricula years ago. I'm going to go fast through this too. We also talk about labor. So Laura Diamond Dixit teaches with us. She's part of the group Who Builds Your Architect, architecture. They've been doing a lot of work examining the impact of architectural labor and migrant labor on mega projects in the Persian Gulf, including Zaha Hadid's work. I'm sure you guys are familiar with some of the criticisms of her for allowing people who were basically enslaved to build her projects. But Professor Diamond Dixon's work also looks at the places that migrant workers are leaving in order to work in the Gulf, right? Like, so she's done work looking at villages in Nepal, where people are coming from, where they're sending remittances, and looking at the ways in which that transforms architecture too. So we wouldn't necessarily think that a building like this is related to a building like this, but the two are in fact entirely dependent upon each other. And I think our cultural histories can teach us this. So this is just a shout out to all of the people that have been making our curriculum so interesting and bringing stories to it. Okay, just in the 2 minutes that I have left, I wanted to talk about agricultural history and architectural history, because this is what my own research has been about. And so we can maybe talk more about this in the discussion as well. But a couple of years ago, the architectural historian David Gibson wrote this blog post about how he felt like he was always teaching Mayan architecture, right? Like the 1 week he spent on, so-called pre-Columbian architecture by talking about corn, and he felt horrible about it. He said, I feel like I'm naturalizing the culture by talking about it only through their food supply. Like, what other cultures do we talk about in the food supply? And I said, oh, well, David, I talk about all cultures' architecture through their food supplies, actually. And so it made me start to think that if we looked at the food supply in every culture in our teaching, that it might help us think about some things. So thinking about architecture and agriculture helps us to diagnose and rethink our relationships to and understandings of the environment. It makes us think about how leisure time, building time, and labor relations enable architecture, right? Like basically if you're someone who has control over a labor force, you can build monumental architecture. If people are fed, they can make it. If not, you've got a problem. So if you have a healthy agricultural system, you likely have a healthy, or maybe not so healthy, but at least a vibrant sort of monumental architectural culture. And then it also helps us to untangle north-south and east-west dichotomies in the present day, right? Like how, where are our bread baskets? Where are we producing things? Where are they getting imported and exported to? Who are the laborers in these systems? And I also think it helps us understand, as you guys saw so beautifully in Tammy's presentation, how architecture is a practice that engages the body as well, obviously through eating and digestion. Instead of teaching the history of postmodern architecture only through its architecture, in my own research, which will soon be out as a book but exists in a number of article forms, if anyone's interested, I've explained how transformations of the French agricultural landscape in the 20th century were brought about but through the work of avant-garde architects who used the sort of site planning techniques that were worked out in the 20s and 30s to reimagine how small plots of agricultural land could be stitched together into modern mega farms, making food cheaper and making way for the sort of what we think of as the postmodern culture of leisure and conspicuous consumption. This transformation of the agricultural landscape we could think of as being a completely isolated event, but it ends up having large-scale urban impacts as well. This is Victor Baltard's 19th century iron and glass masterpiece of the central markets for Paris, Les Halles, which were built from the 1850s through the 60s, and they were demolished quite visibly and to much heartbreak in the 1970s. Parisians hated this. It was like the heart of their city was being ripped up. And this was because these markets could no longer provision the whole city appropriately. They needed to get moved to the suburbs and replaced with more modern and more efficient markets. And this is because of the land reorganization that had happened earlier. The two things were designed to happen in concert with each other, and they were planned and understood by architects. So one thing that happened as a result of this demolition is that there was this empty space in the middle of Paris, and what was built there was the Centre Pompidou, which you guys are all probably familiar with as a very important precedent for studio work, and also this sort of funny postmodern architecture by Jean Rouleval in the middle of it. And so, again, to understand the history of these buildings and to understand their importance to us, we don't need to just look at the things about them that are familiar, like the flexible interior walls of the Centre Pompidou or the ways in which historical forms are reflected in this building, but rather at transformations to infrastructure and landscape that remake how we live. So thinking about the food supply ends up unlocking all of these important stories in architectural history that remake how we see contemporary buildings. I also think we can rethink historic buildings that are part of many of our architectural history canons, if not yours here. So for years and years at Pratt, everyone has taught Angkor Wat because it's this incredible temple with amazing sculptures and a high level of complexity. And we've taught it as a monument. But thanks to some research that Mark Jarzenbeck from MIT put on the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative website, we were also able to understand the way that Angkor Wat is the production of a rice culture, a very well-developed and elaborate one of the Khmer people, who have figured out how to do all these very complex hydroengineering systems around 700 CE to bring water from ponds and catchments into these rice areas. They had surplus rice, they traded it for all this wealth, and their palaces were their way of demonstrating, and their temples were their ways of demonstrating their incredible wealth. And so, looking at the wealth that could be extracted from the tropical forest and managed through forms of infrastructure helps us to understand how monumental architecture is created. And the same thing can happen when we look at Mayan architecture as well. Many of us look at the stelae and pyramids of the Maya and Tikal and Chichen Itza. They're UNESCO, heritage sites. But we could think about them as well through the astronomical knowledge of the Maya, their urban organization, their forms of trade and exchange. And it turns out, in spite of David Gisson's worries, I think also, to a lesser extent, their agricultural knowledge, because while it contributed to their culture, it was not huge. Instead, we study the Maya at Pratt by reading texts. And so I would offer this one, the Popol Vuh, which is this sort of origin story of the Maya people, the Quiché Maya people. And there's this little part of it called the Deeds of Zapata and the 400 Boys. I won't read the whole thing, but it's really this very short, amazing story about a god who finds these 400 boys, and they're trying to construct a house and erect a lintel, and Zapata, being incredibly strong, is able to do it, and he just puts it up like that, as if it were nothing. And the 400 boys take huge offense at this and decide that they're going to kill Zapata. And you read this at first and you think, what's so wrong with making architecture quickly? But then when you start to untangle the story, you realize that what Zapata did was anathemic to how you would build. He didn't bless the lintel, right? He didn't make it into a sacred part of architecture. And so our students read this, and then they later read Logier about the primitive hut, and they realize that actually these stories had existed long before, and that they're not primitive, but that they're the stories about why architecture is significant. So I offer you this, a wide variety of texts and buildings, as a way of thinking about how understanding flows of materials, flows of resources, and important sacred texts can transform the way we think about architecture. Thank you.